We are now looking at ACT 70A, Passage 5. This passage deals with the types of combs, which are the red crests on the top of the head of chickens based on their gene type or their genotype. Now, the introduction explains that there are two types of genes that contribute to the color of this comb. They are gene R and gene P. The introduction also explains that our capital letters indicate dominant alleles and lowercase letters indicate recessive alleles. So let's begin. Number 25 reads, based on their genotypes for gene R and gene P, the parents in each of the big R, little p, and little r, big P, little p crosses most likely had which of the comb types? Now when we look at table 1, we see that our big R, little p genotype would have resulted in a rose comb, and our little r, big P, little p genotype would have resulted in a pea colored comb. So as you read through the potential answers, you see that D gives you precisely that. One parent with a rose comb and the other with a pea comb. Number 26 reads, what was the genotype for gene R and GP of the walnut-combed offspring of the big R, little p, and little r, big P, little p crosses? Now when looking at table 1, and specifically the walnut comb, you'll notice that every one of the genotypes that results in the walnut comb has at least one dominant R gene and at least one dominant P gene. So that tells us that when we look at these parents, they had to have passed on that dominant gene to have walnut-combed offspring. However, when we look at parent 1, we see that there was only one dominant R gene, and parent 2 had none. So that means that they could have only passed one of these on to their offspring. Same with our P gene. They only had one dominant P between the two of them, so they had to have passed that one on. So that being said, our only option with these parents was to have one dominant and one recessive of each of our genes, R and P. Number 27. This reads, based on table 1, which of the following crosses would produce walnut-combed offspring only? Now this is the key right here, only walnut-colored offspring. Now if you recall from 26, we identified that to have the walnut comb, they must have dominant R gene and a dominant P gene. So in order for this to take place, they need to have at least one big R and one big P. Now when you skim through the different options, you see that although, for example, letter B could potentially produce walnut offspring, we cannot say that they will only produce those walnut offspring because these recessive genes might get passed on. So the only option here that would work is letter C, because parent 1 would have to pass on a dominant R gene, and parent 2 would have to pass on a dominant P gene, as those are the only genes that they have to pass on. Number 28. Based on table 1, a chicken that is homozygous recessive, so that means both of their genes would be recessive, or the lowercase letter, for both genes R and genes P will have which type of comb? Well, if you look through these, the only option that would be homozygous recessive for both genes, which means all lowercase letters, little r, little p, is going to be our single comb type. So that's letter J. Now, that information will also help us answer question 29, which reads, suppose that two single-combed chickens were crossed. Now remember, to be single-combed, they need to be homozygous recessive for both genes. It says, based on Table 1, the percentage of the offspring with walnut comb would most likely be closest to which of the following? Well, if you recall from before, we said in order to be a walnut comb, they have to have at least one dominant R gene and at least one dominant P gene. If two single comb parents were to reproduce, there's no way they could pass on either of those dominant genes. So that being said, the only plausible answer is 0%.